Hi, welcome to the Funding Blueprint Unlocking Startup Success, presented by StartHub. I'm Cody Goff, and today is going to be a masterclass focused on the EdTech and knowledge services sectors. We'll talk about effective performance management and forecasting, pricing strategies for global expansion, understanding performance metrics for seemingly intangible things like human flourishing, and how you can create a sustainable business model and still drive social impact. My guest is Nicole Calandra. She's a vice president at Lumos Capital Group, which is an investment firm focused on the human capital development sector globally. They focus specifically on high-growth private companies developing innovative technologies and platforms in education technology, knowledge services, and human capital development. Nicole has an impressive background in strategy and finance roles at LinkedIn, LearnZillion, and Deloitte, and now believes that access to inclusive and equitable education is fundamental to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. She's motivated by the power of education to transform our relationships with our community, with each other, and with ourselves. Nicole is based in New York. To start our conversation, I asked Nicole, for founders in the education technology and knowledge services sectors, what advice do you have for building companies that effectively contribute to the development of human capital, and how can they align their business models with this broader mission? And here's what she told me.
Yeah, it's a great question. And thank you so much, Cody, for having me. It's great to be with you today. So first, I'd say figuring out what is the definition for you of success and impact that you want to be having in moving human capital forward. So the way we think about human capital here at Lumos is just human flourishing. And the way we define impact is access, equity, and outcomes. So which ones are you focused on? Which subgroups are you focused on? And how can you measure the impact that you're having really in a disaggregated way? And to put a real life example to that, some of the companies we look at, they're boot camps, they're hire, train, deploy models. They're trying to help build the pipeline for diverse talent, maybe in the tech field, let's say. So let's say that they had, they realized after disaggregating some of their retention data that they were placing men in careers more often than women that went through their program, right? Let's say that was it. They could dig into why is that happening, right? What about their business model is making it so that there is this unequal or unintended impact? And maybe they go into who's mentors, who is mentoring these people? What is the demographics of these mentors? And really quickly you could figure out, okay, maybe the mentors actually are more men than women, and thus that's why women are dropping out, because they don't see themselves in the people that are coaching them and getting them to the finish line. And that's really insightful. And then they could better align, what they do and how they maybe recruit and hire and train mentors with that outcome in mind to complete their overall mission of building a more diverse tech talent pipeline. So it's just one example of the many ways in which people can take more of a scientific approach, I'd say, to making sure that their business models aligns with their intended mission.
Sure. I can see how access to equity and outcomes, that's measurable, but how about human flourishing? How do you quantify that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's squishy. One of the ways that you can look at that is how the UN Sustainable Development Goals, how they define almost the 17 taken in composition would be human flourishing, no poverty, no hunger, gender equity. So the ones that we align to there are quality education and, employment opportunities, good employment opportunities that lead to economic development and mobility. So those are two ways, but you're right. It's a squishy term.
Yeah. Human capital development broadly, that kind of investment involves both innovation and creating value. So how do you evaluate startups in striking the right balance between pushing innovative boundaries and providing tangible benefits to their users? I'm wondering if you could feel free to share any specific examples around that.
Yeah. Well, I'll start off by saying anything that's innovative needs to be adopted, because if it's innovative and it sits on a shelf somewhere, then it's not really innovative. So, and if it's adopted, then it's leading to some sort of behavior change, right? And so one way that we sort of would evaluate striking the right balance is this innovative technology, are they timing the market right, in a sense, where is the market ready for them in a way? And so Take a really early stage startup, for example, seed stage, and they're testing out their product. They're not going to have like a lot of new users. You can't look at like the total number of MAUs, but what you can figure out is, do they have product market fit? Do people love them? Even if it's just 100 people that keep coming back to them, do they have power users, right? And like that type of profile, someone who's, they don't have mass appeal, but they have a cohort that really loves them. That could tell you something around the value that they're adding to their user base. And then one thing we look at is like, how can you add value? How does the innovation in and of itself add value to the user experience? So not innovating for the sake of innovating, but if the technology is actually driving the human experience, and then how could the innovation actually maybe hinder it? So to give concrete examples, take mathematics, for example, the subject of mathematics. We know that, spatial reasoning and the ability to abstract from physicality is hugely important to be good at math, to getting good grades in math, and to being like having a quantitative mind. We also know that VR is actually a really great way to build that spatial reasoning and that ability to abstract for students. So that's a great marriage of an innovative technology that is actually adding value to the user experience by the way in which the subject is being delivered. Okay, now let's talk about what would hinder value. So in that same vein, there's an amazing book called Invisible Woman that Caroline Perez wrote. They talk about the gender data gap. So in that same vein, VR headsets are sometimes, too big for women. They're not made to fit a woman's face. So that's a way in which you could imagine like that innovative technology not being the right solution in some case scenarios for a certain subpopulation. And maybe they've changed that over time, but that certainly was the case back then when it was first created. So anything that adds complexity to the experience too, not very user friendly, like that's also not really adding value to the user. So those are just some examples.
Sure. So I'm really curious now. I hosted a science podcast for Discovery for a number of years. My co-host was a woman in science. We covered a lot of inequality in scientific research. Like, I'm pretty familiar with this stuff, and I totally hear you on the gender development gap. But in terms of the startup space, I'm really curious. I've talked to a lot of investors and startup founders, and this is a cutthroat space to be in. You need to show that you're reaching the right people at the right time when you have a startup. So when talking about VR headsets, I want to know your perspective on this. If I'm founding a VR company, I'm probably thinking, who's more likely to consume a VR headset? Early adopters tend to skew more towards male in certain segments. A lot of gamers tend to skew male. So like if I'm a developer, some of that designing it with men first seems to make sense just from a profit standpoint, right? Dollars and cents to show an early return. So how, if I'm an early founder in that kind of situation, and I'm thinking, my product would probably sell better with men or with women, how can I future-proof it while ensuring that I'm still turning a profit early on?
I love that we're having this conversation. I think that's an excellent question. So quick example. One of our companies in our portfolio, Transfer VR, they're using like VR simulations to train people who are more like hands-on skilled workers. And one of the industries that they're targeting are healthcare workers. Now, many healthcare workers are women, right? So what I would say to that is, and they're also selling B2B, not B2C, which really with the VR is something that is, if you think about like the smartphone, for example, the smartphone, why it got mass appeal was because corporations started purchasing it for employees. And then employees using it were like, oh, wait, this is actually helpful in my personal life as well. And then they started purchasing it. So then it went from B2B to B2C. I think that's the same sort of evolution that we'll probably see with VR in terms of specifically with human capital development and learning. So there are two things I'd say to that is building it for a broader population will help with growth levers in the future. So imagine, for example, that this wasn't built, Transfer VR or VR wasn't built for women. Well, then it would be pretty hard to penetrate verticals that have a mostly female workforce. So you could see that as like limiting the market and the opportunity. So that's one of the business cases that can be made. Ultimately, you want to pick your audience to begin with, but you want to also build in a way that's scalable and, gives you enough flexibility so that if you don't actually, like if that's not the audience that this product ends up resonating with, you can easily pivot.
Yeah, that reminds me of a thing in video gaming. A lot of video game developers are being urged to think about accessibility early on in the development process and not think about tacking it on later. A really stark example is red-green color blindness. You can't design a whole game and develop all the art assets and then be like, okay, now how do we make it accessible to red-green colorblind people? Because like you've basically designed it wrong from the ground up and you're in trouble at that point.
Absolutely. That's a great example.
Thanks. We're definitely on the same page there. So thank you for exploring that aspect of it. So turning back to your background and, where you've worked in this industry, you were at LearnZillion during a period of significant growth that culminated in an acquisition, which is great. So what lessons can founders learn about navigating rapid growth and a potential acquisition scenario? What critical factors are there to consider maintaining operations, management strategies, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So when I joined LearnZillion, I was in the strategic finance team, and we were about like 30 employees. Now, I was there for about a year and a half, right up until the acquisition. We went from 30 to 60, back down to 30. So it was a period, and our top line was 3xing. Like it was a period, like you said, of immense growth on all fronts, but also our own challenges and struggles. One thing that I learned from that experience, and now being on the other side as an investor, to prepare for rapid growth, you need to ask yourself, is the skill sets that I have amongst my team right now the ones that I will need, later on in the journey? So it's a very different skill set to get from 0 to 10 million than to get from 10 to 20. And often it's very different people in the process and that you need. So that was something that mostly as an investor, actually, I've seen come to life. Then it's culture. So do you have the repeatable processes in place? Do you have any single points of failure within your team? Sometimes there's that one person that, kind of has everything in their head. And if they're somehow let go or not retained, that whole, like some of your secret sauce can fall apart. And so it's making sure that you actually have like standardized processes in place that are repeatable. And then of course, strategy. So is there alignment amongst the broader organization that this is what we're working towards? And it's almost like strategy that translates into actionable and measurable goals. So OKRs, if you will. And so those are some things that as you're navigating periods of immense growth, it's important to have all employees communication, everyone on the same page. Now, in terms of, keep going. In terms of an acquisition and exploring an acquisition, well, it depends if it's a need versus want. If it's the board, if you're running out of funding and your existing investors, aren't willing and you need to go out to the market, like that's a different scenario than if you opportunistically are deciding that you want to explore an acquisition. And so when you're doing that, like important things to consider are timing. Is it the right timing for both the company and the market? And part of that is also like, what is the economic benefit of going to market right now? What's the strategic rationale? Do you have a couple of strategic acquirers in mind and you're really running a tight process? Or is it more so you just want to kind of test out how the market sees you and where they see the value in you? And then it takes a ton of time from the leadership team. And, oftentimes C-suite will try to protect the VPs from getting bogged down in the acquisition talks. But the farther you get, the more time it takes to just produce some of the materials and have those conversations with potential acquirers. So those are just some things to consider.
I've seen startups that bubble up and then down. The employee count goes from like 20 to 70 to 100 to 5 to 3. Is there a pattern that you see in terms of acquisitions? Because like no one wants to acquire a company that's not lean, right? So should people that work for startups be concerned if they're in talks for an acquisition that maybe the CEO decides, hey, I got to trim the fat, and suddenly a bunch of people get cut before they can kind of capitalize on that acquisition?
It's a good question. I would say specifically in this case, it wasn't trimming the fat to prepare for the acquisition. It was more hiring before the growth was really realized, and then realizing we had a right size to extend runway. But I would say, broadly speaking, if you're an employee and you're joining a new startup, do they have a history of being too aggressive with their forecasts, not hitting them, being equally as aggressive with the hiring, hitting those goals? And then there's a mismatch right there between their revenue growth and their cost growth. And so, but for an acquisition in particular, it depends. I would say it depends. Like the higher up you are at a company in the startup space, like usually they need to retain that talent, because in order to get the integration right, you really do want the senior leaders there. Eventually, over time, what will end up happening is just natural attrition. But you really do, especially like the C-suite, you do want them to stay to be able to operationalize the integration. For others, it does depend how capital efficient your startup is. And so there could be an area for concern that if not during the acquisition, shortly thereafter, you will be cut. It's frankly a thought I had too as we were going through the acquisition. Like I'm on the finance team, they have their own finance function. Do they really need two finance managers? Probably not. Probably for a little bit to help them with their books, but then they're probably good afterwards. So yeah, it's a risk reward that you take joining a startup.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I mean, not at a startup even. Like I worked at Discovery during the Warner Media acquisition. So they became Warner Brothers Discovery. But around that time, there was like a year at least after that acquisition where everyone I talked to, they were worried about like, do they need me? And then a bunch of other financial stuff came out. And obviously it became very clear there were many more cuts to be made, and they did make those cuts. And it's really still an ongoing thing even today. Who knows when it'll be resolved? But, Discovery's a multi-billion-dollar company. And even there, it can impact everybody, I mean, mergers and acquisitions are scary, right? So, from your experience, was there anything when you were with that organization that got acquired, was there anything the leadership did in particular that you found to be helpful in helping the employees get through that process?
Yeah, I mean, I will just say in terms of the acquisition, being like open at the right times is pretty helpful. So, you want to make sure that at least the senior leadership team, first of all, you don't want people to find out through their friends in the industry. That would be a big no-no. So because that creates panic and fear. And so they did a really good job on making sure that, it was a secretive process until, a few people knew about it, and that it was communicated in a way to show like, this is the value in what this combined entity could look like. And here's how we can advance the mission that we are all so dedicated towards fulfilling and seeing through. So making sure that it stays a lockbox and it's a small circle until it needs to be a bigger circle, making sure no one else finds out until they need to. And then being very transparent as to the why and the vision forward.
That's fair. So transparency, and do not overlook internal comms. Yes. Which I have worked at startups that have done that very well, and I have worked at startups that have done that not very well. And the not very well has directly led to attrition on teams that significantly impacted the business. And I have had to lead through some situations where things just kind of fell apart, and it's no fun for anybody. So do not overlook the importance of internal comms. So let's talk about some other experiences you've had. During your time at LinkedIn, you focused on performance management and predictability for a very fast-growing business. So what insights can you share for founders about effectively managing performance, planning for the long term, especially in high-growth industries like education technology?
Yeah. So in the strategic finance role at LinkedIn, my team was really working closely with the R&D team to forecast out our marketplace revenue. And so we were working with them to understand how are experiments that you're launching in the ecosystem really going to be impacting our revenue forecast going forward. So one thing that I found was an amazing muscle that just was ingrained in LinkedIn's processes was attribution. So if we saw our budgets deviating or our forecast deviating from our actual revenue was in a day, we would get right to the bottom of what was driving that change. Like, why is that happening? Because if you don't, then those types of call it potentially ecosystem issues or what have you, they just accumulate going forward. And then the longer it goes without understanding what was driving the past performance, it makes it hard to understand what will drive future performance. So I found that was an incredible skill set almost that they taught me. And when I'm saying frequent monitoring, it was like every day it was looking at, granted, LinkedIn's an auction and it's a marketplace. So companies that are called B2B SaaS, they don't necessarily need to be doing this on a daily basis. Why did we miss our revenue goals? Why did we miss our sales goals? They'll be able to figure it out pretty quickly over a week's time, maybe call it week or month time. But really understanding what were we assuming? What didn't happen? Why didn't it happen? What can we do going forward? It's great. It was greatly important. And then something that I think founders would be kind of that I grew to understand more and more in this role is, your forecasting accuracy has broad implications on just real people's lives. So if we are too conservative, then the business isn't going to spend and hire as much as they otherwise would have. But the company's, of course, overperforming. So now the existing employees are stretched thin, right? Because we didn't make those significant people investments that we need to make because we were too conservative on our own forecasts. Take the flip side, and then potentially you're letting people go in a few months because you were overly optimistic. And, there's differences between sort of what you go out to market to say, this is what we think we can do. And these are the assumptions behind that and almost how you budget internally. Because it's really people's careers that will be impacted in the process of just being off by 20% here and there.
So I'd like to follow up on what you said about LinkedIn being so good at forecasting. Other than looking at things every day, what made them so good about forecasting? In terms of any process, tool, approach, philosophy, basically any technique that a founder could look to as a good example of what they can maybe emulate.
I would say, first we had a team dedicated to it, which a lot of founders, they have finance functions, but these are controllers. These are almost people who are, helping make sure that the books are clean. Super important function. Strategic finance is a bit different. And then I think it's a bit nuanced. And I rarely see this role in a lot of growth stage companies. So I think first, having a team that was dedicated to just doing this made LinkedIn good at it. And then, really going back and understanding trends, because sometimes it's hard when you're trying to figure out why you miss forecasts, what is actually what happened in the past. Basically it's benchmarking. How can we benchmark what we think we should have gotten today in terms of our revenue based on what we did? And we had a good understanding of benchmarks because we had a good understanding of what drove the variability in our revenue in the past. And so we knew this is a clean benchmark. This is what we should be expecting going forward. If we see deviations from it, then we know that there's something either wrong or something that we haven't baked in. So just building that muscle really early on. It's hard to jump in if you're at 20 million in revenue, be now we're going to start attributing our past performance and what drove it.
Right. So start measuring early, it sounds like, is a good takeaway.
Exactly.
Yeah. So pricing strategy is also crucial in the education technology sector. How can founders set effective pricing strategies that balance accessibility with the need for sustainable business models?
Yeah, it's something that we run across too. And it's funny, we just hosted Harvard Kennedy School students here at Lumos, and they asked this essentially the same question in terms of if you're trying to promote access, oftentimes there's pricing restrictions especially for B2C companies, right? And so how do you also balance access with, just making money? And one thing that I would say is it depends who's paying. So in the market, sometimes there's, let's say a school district that's paying on behalf of teachers and students. And so there's different willingness to pay for a school district than there would be maybe for a student in, the Los Angeles school district. And so one thing that I would say is a common pitfall that people do with pricing strategies is they look at their competitor pricing and they say where should we be based on where our competitors are today? And where that's missing is sometimes that's not really taking into account the value that you're bringing that is differentiated from what your competitors are doing. And so just by looking at the range and maybe taking a midpoint or taking a point there, you're not really truly understanding the value that you bring to the user, and thus you're really not understanding how much they would be willing to pay for your product. And then one other pitfall is that signaling. Like your pricing, in a way, just like for any product that we have, take it like a blouse to a backpack. Like the higher price it is, the better quality we think it is. The lower price it is, the lower quality we think it is. Like it's a signal. And so what signal are you trying to send to the market with your pricing? And I think that's something that's quite important. In terms of getting it right, ideally you would be able to figure out the ROI that you're providing, right? And so how are we priced versus compared to the cost that this customer is saving by just using our platform? And it's pretty hard to quantify, but in the best cases, I've seen companies do that. And then that's a pretty compelling value prop to the customer.
So I would imagine that would be a customer-facing metric that they're also using as a sales tool, right?
Correct. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Very cool. So Lumos Capital Group has a global focus. For founders looking to expand their services globally, what considerations should they keep in mind, particularly in like different education systems in different markets?
Yeah. Well, when looking and, trying to expand globally, one needs to remember that there's so many nuances, even within regions, like different localities. So what we've seen that's been successful with international expansion is maybe starting out with a partnership-based approach. So finding channel partners or resellers that know the region really well. They can test out the market for you. If you're feeling like there's good traction there and you're seeing good traction, then you can commit resources to building out your own, direct sales team in that region. It will also help you understand what about the product, because the feedback that you'll get from them will hopefully be valuable. It's a deep partnership. You'll understand what are the product features or what are the product changes that we need to be making to be accessible and adopted in this market.
I love that. So start with partnerships. I mean, the people who are physically located in the place that you want to go to probably know the trends and industry a little bit better than you might if you're just moving into that market. Makes sense. So I want to turn to your involvement with Brighter Children, your commitment to philanthropy in the education sector. How can startups integrate social impact into their business models? And what benefits do you see in fostering a strong connection between profit-making ventures and nonprofit initiatives?
Yeah. So, in these highly regulated sectors, such as education, there needs to be such a strong connection between what the nonprofit sector and what the for-profit's doing, because they're often overlapping and working together and partnering. So to give one tangible example, we just acquired a company called learning.com, which offers K-12 curricula in digital literacy and computer science for U.S. schools and districts. And they have partnerships with a few, actually, let's call it curriculum players like Common Sense Media, which is a nonprofit that produces content in digital safety and online citizenship, right? So that's one of their content partners. We just think the pairing of the nonprofit and for-profit space here is really helpful and additive, and helps them augment what they're already doing and what they're both striving to do, which is make all of us more digitally fluent and ready for the 21st century with the skills that we need to be successful. So it amplifies both of our missions. And then remember, most universities are nonprofits. And so there are models like Podium, one of the companies we invest in, that partners with universities to offer these tech courses to students. And these are courses that are usually universities aren't very good at offering, web development, digital marketing, more cutting edge, advanced, emerging tech trends, and really preparing these students for the future and careers in these space. So that's one type of partnership that's so common in our industry, is these partnerships with these higher ed institutions. So it's very useful. At best, nonprofits serve, in my perspective, nonprofits serve as these test cases for governments to say, does this work? Whatever we're doing, does this work? And if so, can governments then adopt it and roll it out at a much larger scale? And that's essentially would be such a win-win for our companies as well.
Love that. And I am glad that you're working on solutions for the future of prepping people for the digital world. I am a father of 2 young children, and I am utterly terrified of just how quickly things change and how it feels like there's no way education can keep up with the changes in order to sufficiently prepare people. So if a startup founder ever comes to you with a pitch for something that makes parents feel less completely terrified, I mean, I'm your N equals 1. Please invest. Sounds like a good bet to me. There's a market for it.
Well, I hope learning.com is used in their schools.
Me too for sure. So speaking of technologies, I've got one more question to wrap up. And that's Lumos Capital Group invests in innovative technologies for human capital development. I'm sure you're probably going to say AI, maybe not. What trends or technologies do you believe will have a transformative impact on the EdTech and human capital sectors? And how do you think founders can position their companies accordingly?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'll leave AI aside. It's probably well spoken about on other podcasts better than I can do. But one of the trends, at least, that I'm excited about, not technologies, is this education to employment pathways, like apprenticeship models that are gaining more funding and traction in the US. Granted, apprenticeships are not new. They've been around since the 70s, potentially earlier than that. And in European countries and other countries, they are much more widespread. In fact, like the UK has more apprentices than the US, and they're a fifth of the population. So just to give you an example of how much we lag in that territory. But I think it's incredibly interesting because it's a learning to earning pathway. So you're learning on the job and you're also making money while doing it. So it's a win-win for the individual. One thing that I think is necessary for apprenticeships to gain more traction here in the US, besides sustainable, stable government funding, which is something that we've seen with the launch of the Apprenticeships Build America grant in 2022, which dedicated a lot of funding towards this specifically. We need to see a bit of rethinking of the regulation that we have in the U.S. around how apprenticeships are even defined. They were written, I think it was in the 70s to help with defining apprenticeship models within trade industries, but they haven't really modernized. So what do tech apprenticeships look like? And there's a lot of regulatory hurdles to even becoming a registered apprenticeship program. But I'm excited about it because I think there's a real demand right now from these tech companies and such that they want to diversify their pipeline. They're having trouble finding talent. There is this ever-growing skills gap, and it's a great way of filling the skills gap in a way that is quite affordable for the individual. Not to mention, it's sort of a beautiful, to the point around nonprofits and for-profits partnering, it's sort of a beautiful partnership that you're seeing in apprenticeships right now, where you have these nonprofits that are finding this untapped talent and then pairing them with apprenticeship programs like Open Classrooms, which is one of Lumos's portfolio companies, and who is also finding the employers to then go and provide a holistic recruiting to training solution for an employer. So I think the need's there. I think the market is there. We just need a couple of more, government and, let's say, private sector energy behind making it more popular.
That's really interesting to me, in terms of timing, because it's not only the demand from those companies for those companies, but I presume now is also the right time because people in the US seem to be more open to alternatives in the US to the traditional college model amid growing skepticism about the value of a college education, against the price of it. Is that a major factor in your analysis and the way that you're approaching that?
Absolutely. Alternative higher education is something that we are, is a trend that we're following, that we've made bets in, but it's a space that we think is, it's exactly it. And one thing that's too, when you think about cultural shifts in terms of personalities related or opinions related to the ROI of a 4-year university degree. On the flip side, there's also stigmas around apprenticeship models in the US in the past, right? And so they could be seen as lower quality job opportunities. And I think we need to change that in tandem. But I do think the market tailwinds around these alternatives popping up and people being more receptive to them is really positive.
Yeah, it's a very interesting class bias. And I have an in-law who's a professional electrician. He works on like enterprise corporations and their corporate data centers and stuff. And I guarantee he makes a lot more money than me, right? Like this guy is just doing really great work and that's that. So I hear what you're saying. I hope that stigma goes away a bit. Like I've got money saved away for my kids for 15 years from now when they go off into the world. And the first time we worked with a contractor on a house remodel, I turned to my wife and said, if he wants to become an apprentice, I'm okay with that. Based on how much this guy just charged me for like 3 days of work, I think he'd be doing pretty good. Not that money should be the be all end all, but like there's certainly opportunities outside of the traditional college model.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then seeing those apprenticeships with not just these trade industries, but also the modern tech force and using that is a big opportunity. But I agree, you could make more than a living wage for so many of these overlooked sectors.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing so many great insights today, Nicole. I really appreciate it. And just before we wrap up, are there any particularly impactful companies in your portfolio? I know you mentioned learnings.com. Any other ones that you'd like to bring the listeners' attention to before we wrap up?
Yeah. So mentioned Transfer. We talked about IronHack. Well, I actually don't think we talked about IronHack. Well, basically what I'll say is they're all impactful in their own ways. So in terms of innovative technologies, Transfer, VR training simulations for those that are, looking to enter the workforce or maybe upskill. For one that we recently did an investment in, Disperse, they're an enterprise learning platform that's not only, we not only admire it for its potential to serve employees and employers across all markets, but also because they built a platform that serves all workers, so knowledge and frontline workers. And that's one we're quite excited about. Talked a little bit about open classrooms. They're providing online stackable accredited higher education and workforce training programs and offering these alternative pathways to higher education that we spoke endlessly about, as well as IronHack. They're, think like providing critical training solutions for those that are entering the tech workforce. So those are two that are very much in line with one of the themes. And then specifically thinking of like these nonprofit partnerships, one, Book Nook, they are one of the only ESSA Tier 2 certified B2B virtual tutoring solutions. They have done this. They have partnered with these nonprofits to better serve schools, districts. Learning.com, we spoke about. Podium, same, they're filling gaps in existing universities' curricula for high quality courses that have employment relevancy and real world applicability. And then we didn't talk about this because we specifically said we would not talk about this. But, when you think about opportunities within AI, one of our companies, Online MedEd, they are, a go-to digital instructional resource for aspiring healthcare professionals. Over 70% actually of medical students in the US have used OMI, which is pretty cool statistic. But
Wow.
Yeah. They're currently figuring out like how can we embed AI to generate content and personalized assessments, and that's an area that we see not just with OMI but across a lot of these curriculum companies that we're pretty excited about.
Wow, that is a lot, and I think people need to go check out Lumos Capital Group to learn more. Nicole Calandra is a vice president at Lumos Capital Group. You can learn more about Lumos Capital Group at lumoscapitalgroup.com. That's LUMOS. Tremendous insights today, Nicole. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. Good luck with all of your portfolio companies. They all sound like home runs to me, and we will be keeping an eye on your work in the future for sure.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Funding Blueprint is produced by me, Cody Goff. I also did a little bit of editing on today's episode, which was mostly edited by Sean Patel. If you're looking for someone to do most of your editing, or you're looking for someone who can do top-tier sound design or audio-video production work, then get in touch with Sean at seanpatel.com. Thank you again for joining me, and have a great week.